Overcoming by Purefoysgirl. Chapter 16. It took several hours to reach the village, and, once there, Will had no idea where he was going. Duxbury was not as large as the town that had sprung up south of Hertford House, but it was large enough to have a main street with a proper cobbled road and several fine little shops doing brisk business. Deciding not to risk getting lost, Will carefully swung down from his mare's back and looped her reins over a hitching ring at the least busy storefront, which looked to be some kind of dress shop. Holding his basket half behind him, Will pushed the door open, wincing at the merry jangle of bells above, which got the attention of a bright-eyed, plump-cheeked blonde woman behind the counter. "Well, good mornin'," she said, her voice pleasantly raspy and warm. She came around the corner with a wide smile, so delighted to see him that Will actually looked behind him to see if there was someone there. "Can I help you?" Yes, sorry," he said, flushing a little. I'm afraid I'm a bit lost." Her brows rose. "Now that is a surprise," she said, chuckling, "considering what a large and confusing town we are." Will smiled at that, her friendliness putting him at ease. "Maybe I can help you find your way, Mr. Graham," Will said, offering his free hand, which she shook with the same sure confidence of a beta male. "Will Graham." "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Graham," she said. "You can call me Molly, or Miss Foster if you like, but I prefer Molly. We're not much for formalities around here. So, where are you trying to get that you find yourself stranded in my dress shop?" "I was told there is a cemetery nearby," Will said, and hastily added, "the Lecter family cemetery, rather." "Ah." Her full mouth pursed, and a troubled look fell over her face. "Any particular reason you're looking for it?" "I'm trying to confirm something. Seeing the grave markers would help." "Well, I'm not sure how it could help you," Molly said, moving back behind her counter to grab a flannel shawl. She wrapped it over her shoulders and pinned it with absent precision before grabbing a rather floppy and shapeless hat. "But I'll take you there." "Oh, no, your business—" I know. Chasing all these customers away," she said, looking round the empty store with a soft chuckle. "Shame on me. I needed some air anyways, and I don't want to find out later you've gotten lost in the fields. Come along, Mr. Graham." She moved past him and flipped the sign on the window, holding the door wide for Will, who hurried back outside in the face of her insistence. He gathered his mare's reins back up and set out after Molly when she beckoned him, following her down the street. "Where are you from, Mr. Graham?" she asked, precisely his height and keeping a good pace that ate up the distance. "Hertford Town," he said. Figuring it was close enough, he was reluctant to tell her who he was. He didn't want her to suddenly feel pressured by his status when he had none, in truth. "Really?" "Oh, no wonder you're interested in the Lecter plots. Are you a writer?" "No, nothing so interesting as all that," Will said, laughing a little and picking his footing carefully as they turned off onto a thready, barely discernible trail that vanished into the thickening wood. "Well, then what?" she asked, taking the lead. Molly, I don't wish to lie to you," he said, ducking a branch and holding it to pull the mare behind him. "I'd really rather not discuss myself." "Fair enough," she said, her throaty laughter floating back to him. "I'll talk it over for the both of us. My mother always tried to tell me I chatted too much, but I never did hear her." She looked over her shoulder at him and winked, adding, "I was always too busy talking. Come on, Mr. Graham, just this way." The wood gradually thinned to high grass where the trail was clearly worn down, branching off in several directions where it crossed a main footpath. The sun was climbing higher in the cloudless sky, and Will wished for his hat to shield his eyes, envying Molly the one she kept clapped to her head against the wind. "Here we are, just down here, Mr. Graham," she said, vanishing suddenly below the level of the grass. Alarmed, Will quickened his pace to find himself standing on the rise of a very high hill, looking down at a wide-spread cemetery in the wooded valley below. The high grass was neatly cut in a wide swath around the outside of the stacked stone wall, and the ground within was well cared for. The paths were even and lined with stone, the mausoleums and headstones scrubbed clean, and sitting tranquil beneath the sheltering spread of massive oak tree branches that shaded them. "Come on," Molly called, pausing halfway down the hill to beckon him. "She'll be fine." Will descended at a careful angle, his mare plodding along beside him, snorting into his ear. Will led her to the cemetery entrance and fastened her to a low-hanging branch, leaving her to munch the cropped grass in the shade where the dew still lay heavy and wet. "Well, here we are," Molly said, watching him tether the mare. "Yes, here we are," Will said, putting the basket down next to the wall. He moved inside with silent appreciation and respect, taking in the change in atmosphere here inside this pleasant, shaded resting place for generations of lectors. "I had thought it would be bigger." "They lost a lot of people overseas. They were either buried there or there wasn't enough left to send home," Molly said just behind him. She pulled her hat from her head and fanned herself with it, looking around with melancholy that seemed odd for people who were strangers to her. "Only the main family rests here. Direct heirs and their spouses, whatever children they had who died young or unmarried. Every whipstitch they move the far wall out, but I imagine it'll be years before they have to do that again. For a bunch of alphas, they don't breed much anymore." Will nodded idly at that, moving towards the newer stones, searching the names, but mainly after the dates. He was vague on the dates. Hannibal had left the continent to go to war when Will was a mere 8 years old. But he was confident he could find the grave of Hannibal's first wife, and at least put a name to the mystery. "So, what are you looking for, Mr. Graham?" Molly asked, moving to a stone at the far end of the cemetery where she crouched to trace the lettering. "I'm just chasing shadows," Will sighed and laughed softly. "Honestly, I don't know why I'm here or what I hope to find." He trailed off when he reached the end of the row Molly was in, and saw a group of stones that caught his eye. One headstone was topped with the likeness of a cherub, draped as if sleeping, wings folded in restful repose. It was clearly a child's stone, and engraved beneath the angel was the name Misha Lecter. Suffocating darkness and terror, the roar of water, the scream of breaking wood and frightened horses. "How terrible," Will breathed, shuddering as he recalled Bedelia's sad story of what had occurred. She was so young. "Misha? 4 years was barely enough time for anything. It's always so sad when it's the little ones," Molly said, straightening to come closer. "Are you very familiar with the family? There was a terrible accident. Mother and father died with her, see? All buried on the same day." Will looked at the stones around little Misha's grave as Molly pointed to them. One read Cyrus Lecter, beloved son. It was a beautiful stone, but certainly nowhere near as grand as the mausoleums that housed past generations of Lecter heirs. It chilled Will to think that the warm, loving old man he'd come to rely on had been capable of cutting his son so entirely free of his affections that this exiled stone was the only marker of his life. There was a stone to the left of Cyrus Lecter, much more weathered, in the likeness of a goddess gazing upward at the sky. "Saule Lecter, beloved daughter and precious wife," Will read, and thought of the portrait in the gallery at Hertford House, the woman with dark ringlets and a secretive smile. That very same picture was placed next to a gaping emptiness which had once housed Cyrus Lecter's likeness. Saule Lecter, Hannibal's mother, whose date of death was precisely Hannibal's birthday. Bedelia had certainly failed to mention that, though in retrospect he should have realized it by her phrasing. The former Lady Clarges had died from childbirth, either during or from complications, and her bereft husband had promptly deposited Hannibal at Fernhill in his sister's care and fled the country. "Sad, isn't it?" Molly asked, lingering at his side. "The loss of a life is always cause for sadness," Will murmured, thinking on what Bedelia had told him. "I wonder if there was any fondness in their marriage." "Some, I'm sure. Though when you're breeding for lineage, I suppose things like affection and fondness don't weigh as heavily as one's pedigree." "Duty," Will sighed, frowning. "A poor man is free in his choices where a nobleman is not." "A nobleman can afford to be stripped of some choices," Molly said, smiling a little to soften her sharp response. "I'm sure there's a poor man or two who'd marry anyone he was told to if it meant he had a warm, sure meal and place to rest his head without slaving his life away." "That is an excellent point," Will conceded. His curiosity about Hannibal's stepmother overcame him then, and he turned his attention to the other stone situated next to Cyrus Lecter's, but positioned in such a way that it gave Will the impression of exclusion. It was a begrudging grave, on the far side of Misha, closest to the path. There were markings on it, characters and lettering unfamiliar to Will. Below the letters was an etching of an opera mask, with the dates of her birth and death. Will had imagined she was very young, this woman who had snared Cyrus Lecter's interest. It surprised him to see that she had been just shy of her 40th birthday when she died, nearly 10 years her husband's senior. It made logical sense when he considered that she had been famous in the opera before meeting him, but for some reason he had imagined her nearer to his own age. "I wish I had a means with which to read her name," Will murmured, frustrated that even in this she would remain elusive. "I wish I had a means to know more about her at all." "Murasaki," Molly supplied, surprising him. She laughed at his startled expression and said, "Believe me, she was famous even in Duxbury." "In what way, Molly? Her being an opera singer?" "Oh, she wasn't just an opera singer, Mr. Graham. Before she was Cyrus's concubine, she was famous on the continent. She performed for kings and queens and had love affairs and duels fought over her," Molly said, bending to brush a stray leaf from the stone's flattened top, her voice filled with soft admiration for a life of such excitement. "She was from somewhere so far away, I have no idea how people ever get to there from here. Apparently, she came from some kind of royal line there and left when her family was wiped out. There are so many versions of every story told, I could never tell what was real or not. But I loved hearing all of them when I could. I mean, I never knew her, obviously. She was dead a long time before I was born. But the story circulated for years, mostly because she was—" "Oh, Megan," Will breathed, conclusions rapidly forming. He knew from Bedelia's story that Cyrus had brought her home at some point after Hannibal's birth, and from the dates on Misha's stone, it could not have been too long after. "Yes," Molly said, frowning. "People can be so awful about it." "She was the one who raised him," he said, swiping at his heated forehead, suspicions confirmed. "And Omega raised Hannibal." "Hannibal?" Molly said, snorting with disdain that startled Will. "You're that familiar with Lord Clarges? Be careful he doesn't damage you, Mr. Graham. That man is a menace." Her sudden vitriol surprised him into looking at her, and Will was dismayed by the unhappy expression on her face. "Why would you say that, Molly?" he asked, nervous that his fears would be given life, that he would find out that his husband was indeed capable of arranging an accident for him to remove him entirely. Molly's sparkling eyes flashed fire when she met his gaze, and her words were sharp as glass when she spat, "Because he killed my sister." Hannibal found himself reluctant to ask after Will come morning, still reflecting on their exchange last night and the revelations Berger had made. Hannibal worried that he might look at Will and that his perceptive little spouse would see that his long-held, bone-deep prejudices had sunk on their foundations, not so much bedrock as sand, shifting and uncertain, and might somehow think even less of him than he already did. Since his earliest memories, he'd been raised with an understanding that he now found to be baseless. To lose that certainty, to question his own judgment and everything he thought was reality, it was startling and alarming. He had, indeed, walked a world where people had played to his perceptions, content to keep him in willful ignorance. Some had done it, he knew, from deliberate intention to use those beliefs to their advantage, to push their own agendas with him. Others, such as Berger, had done it to avoid rousing Hannibal's temper. And so many lives had suffered for it. So many lives had been lost for it. It had taken Will, with his righteous violence and sharp intelligence, to wrap his slender fingers around those scales and pull them from Hannibal's eyes without hesitation, forcing him to see the truth. He had never once been anyone other than himself, so perfectly honest and without guile that Hannibal had no choice but to acknowledge him. How much he could have changed had Hannibal met someone like Will when he was younger, before he married Melinda, before he fled to the battlefields to drown his guilt in blood and death. It left Hannibal thoughtful and contemplative, absorbed enough in his musings that he took a small breakfast alone in the solarium. He didn't enjoy it quite so much as he'd hoped, considering his unpredictable spouse wasn't present to distract him, but Berger made his way in with a packet of letters to tide him over. Hannibal found it was a bundle of mail sent from Galley Field for him, his usual correspondence from patients and tenants, invitations for events in the capital, and various journals he subscribed to in order to remain abreast of the latest medical knowledge. Alana's letter he saved for last, and opened it as the servants came to clear away his breakfast. Hannibal, I hope this letter finds you well, and having great success in your efforts at reconciling with your grandfather. I did promise I would write to you on occasion in your absence, and especially wanted to do so now, as a reminder that we are all managing quite happily here without anything in the world to trouble our thoughts but what actions you might take in haste. Marissa is doing very well, and has begun to dash about everywhere. She is running darling Margot ragged. I was sure I would need to ask you for a tonic to soothe her nerves, our girl has been so vexing. She insists on climbing the stairs the moment one's eyes are averted, and it seems she is instantly in any single place that is dangerous for her. I am not sure who to worry over more, the child or my Margot. I have had encouraging news from the committee you convened on the subject of the school here. I have sent along their letter for you to read at your leisure. By this time next year we will break ground, and I am sure I have never felt more proud at what we have accomplished. Margot, of course, is attempting to keep my head firmly on my business rather than in the clouds, but I find myself dreaming of the day when the women we enabled with knowledge will stand equally with men in the medical field, and it gives me hope. The babe is healthy, strong and kicking, much as the one before him. I am sure he will be a boy this time. I dearly hope and pray so. You have kept your promise to me, Hannibal, and I will keep my promise to you. A boy for your grandfather, though I remain somewhat skeptical at your assurances that he will accept him as a viable heir. On that matter, I must urge you, strongly urge you, to remember us with fondness and care, and impart some measure of that feeling on your spouse, however you may view him. He has never once intruded on your decisions, nor made a burden of himself in any respect. You have chided me before on my defense of him, Hannibal, but I stand by my words, for I know all too well what it is like to be despised by those who should love us. I will say in closing, be careful with him, Hannibal. You left him a child behind you, and he has become a man in your absence, who must all too well recall how badly you parted. Be gentle with him, as you were with us, and do nothing impulsive. All our fondest affections, Alana, Margot, Marissa. Hannibal sighed and read the letter twice before tucking it into his jacket, reflecting on her entreaty. He didn't write back. On those short occasions when they were not together, he had never written back. But he almost wanted to, if only to warn her of what Thomas would no doubt tell her the moment he visited. It relieved him that he was not at Galleyfield, in all honesty. He wasn't entirely prepared to handle Alana's scolding, even soft as it would be. Instead, he opened his letter from the committee, penned a series of instructions to his solicitor on the subject of the school he was sponsoring, and then composed an advert for an estate manager out of sheer desperate distraction. He rang for Hawks, who arrived with such haste that Hannibal was sure he'd been hovering outside the door, and handed off his correspondence, saying, "Send these down to the post, and have them mailed to the capital immediately." "Nothing too terrible, I do hope, my lord," Hawks said, turning immediately to hand it off to the footman behind him, where it was all whisked into the sure hands of Hertford House's serving staff, and would be cared for appropriately. "Just some instructions for the capital clerks. I'm posting the position for estate manager," Hannibal said, remarking the way Hawk's bushy eyebrows drew together in disapproval. Smiling slightly at the wordless reproof, Hannibal said, "Will shall soon have his hands full with tending the next lector heir, Mr. Hawks. He cannot be troubled with the running of Hertford House for some time." "Are congratulations in order, my lord?" Hawks inquired, knowing damned good and well he and Will had shared nothing more than mutual baiting and a few rooms to date. "There is the matter of convincing Mr. Graham," Hannibal said, catching that slight disapproval again at his choice in words. "But I am supremely confident in my ability to do so." "I have every faith you will require such well-deserved confidence, my lord," Hawks said, a sly smile barely touching his lips, "as Mr. Graham is a remarkably stubborn young man when his mind is set. Well then, like all bull-headed creatures, we will clash until one of us yields," Hannibal said, amused. "I am not entirely certain, my lord, that you should attempt such a thing," Mr. Hawks offered, causing Hannibal to laugh. "He is unusual, isn't he, Mr. Hawks?" Hannibal asked, getting to his feet to look idly around the room, taking in the small, unobtrusive changes his mate was responsible for. Not a single room of Hertford House missed his deft and subtle touch except for his own suite. It was strange to think of Will avoiding it all these years, a quiet respect for his privacy that Hannibal had not expected.
"An original, I believe, is the term, my lord."
Hannibal smiled at that.
"Oh, I do like that. I thought perhaps you would."
Hannibal's smile faded then.
"It seems rather lonely here."
Mr. Hawks said nothing, but remained attentive.
"Hertford House is meant to host parties and foster large families,"
Hannibal said, thinking of the house as it had been in his childhood.
"It is sad to see it so bereft. It has been very quiet here, my lord, all things considered. Grandfather's illness. But Will, has he had no one at all to keep him company? Lord du Maurier visits when he is in the countryside, my lord."
"But none of Will's family," Hannibal mused.
"Has he mentioned his father?"
Mr. Hawks frowned solemnly.
"No, my lord. Mr. Graham has had no contact with any member of his family since his arrival here, and rarely speaks on personal matters."
"No contact whatsoever," Hannibal echoed, fixing Hawks with a stern look. Though Will himself had admitted that even his sisters had not dared to contact him, he felt compelled to ask, "Not even letters?"
"I believe he wrote to the Earl soon after your departure, my lord, but the letter was returned unopened."
Hannibal frowned, locking his hands together behind his back and rocking slightly, his irritation escaping him in small tells that his butler knew all too well.
"Unopened indeed," he murmured.
He gave Mr. Hawks a tight, unhappy smile, adding,
"I doubt he will return a letter from my grandfather unopened." "One does very much doubt so, my lord," Mr. Hawks said, giving him a slight smile in return. "Might I offer an opinion, my lord?"
Hannibal's brows rose.
"Perhaps it would be more considerate of Mr. Graham if the Earl was not asked to Hertford House,"
Mr. Hawks said, unusually candid with him.
"I have no firm understanding, given that Mr. Graham never speaks of his family, but it would seem the relationship has suffered since his arrival here. Perhaps a less public setting would better suit a reunion in case he were to become unpleasant." "Surely you jest, Mr. Hawks. Even had he such an inclination to be rude, the Earl would have to be very brave indeed to believe he could get away with such behavior,"
Hannibal said. When Hawks became rather still, he darkly added,
"Of course, considering my treatment of Will, he would assume his child has no friends here. I did not wish to be indelicate, Mr. Hawks, I assure you. I would sooner expect the ground to swallow me whole than for you to be indelicate,"
Hannibal said, and sighed heavily.
"Thank you, Hawks. Your candor is appreciated."
That earned him an incline of Mr. Hawks's silver-haired head.
"Hawks, might you know of any place here in Hertford House that is Will's?"
Hannibal asked, noting the slight spasm of the old butler's eyebrows.
"That he is comfortable in, rather. I find very little trace of him here at Hertford House, as if he does not live here at all." "Yes, my lord," Hawks told him, recovering. "There is a small space that Mr. Graham has claimed for himself in the attic."
Appalled, Hannibal asked,
"Why in the seven hells is he sequestered away in the attic?"
Which only garnered him a bland, hooded look from his butler, who said with sonorous dignity,
"I honestly did not feel it my place to question him, my lord."
It carried a subtle undertone suggesting that Hannibal should not question it either, all things considered. Embarrassed that he had to be chastised by his help, Hannibal took himself off to the nearest servants' passage and clambered up to where the Hertford domestics made their living quarters. The attic proper was not secured against entry, but none of the servants would risk their livelihood for the sake of curiosity, so Hannibal had no doubt that it remained undisturbed, except for Will. He made his way cautiously up the narrow stairs, and emerged into dusty sunlight admitted through the attic windows. It was a maze of storage, but a goodly portion of the attic was still unused, with more than enough large rooms to house whatever hobbies Will had managed in his limited spare time. It took some searching on his part, but Hannibal finally located it, back against the far end of the house, far from any of the stairways. The room he had chosen, unsurprisingly, was a small one, with its own window, and was empty of Will himself, much to Hannibal's disappointment. But it was not so empty of Will's presence as the rest of Hertford House. The window was clean and sparkling, the walls, rafters, and floor all diligently kept spotless. A single desk was under the window, the chair pushed in, its surface arranged with a plethora of tools and items that Hannibal could not make sense of at first. Then he noticed the lures, dangling from fish-line in orderly rows from pegs, and realized what Will was about. "You're an artist after all," he mused, pulling the little chair out and settling at Will's desk. He had a lure in progress, and Hannibal amused himself for a moment peering at it through the supported magnifying glass poised over it. Spools of colored thread, snips, bare hooks, assorted feathers, bits of small found objects, neatly arranged on the desktop. It was quite a collection, and each lure was unique. "These are your watercolors," Hannibal murmured, looking at each in turn with growing appreciation and pain, as he thought about Will up here, alone, working in silence on pieces that no one would ever see. It bothered him deeply, even more so when he began to count the sheer number of lures Will had made over the past 6 years. Hannibal got to his feet and really looked at them, picking his favorites down carefully. He gathered a nice showing before heading back downstairs to see Hawks.
"Ah, my lord, there is a gentleman, Hawks. I want you to have these mounted and framed," Hannibal said, thrusting the lines at him.
Mr. Hawks, who had not been rattled when his youthful master had flung a frog at him as a child, did not so much as bat an eyelash to have Will's lures offered to him.
"And is there some particular way you would prefer, my lord?"
he asked, adjusting with admirable ease.
"Surprise me,"
Hannibal said, earnestly adding,
"Several small frames, nothing too ostentatious, and have them set up in various parlors." "Yes, my lord. Where they may be seen by visitors, is that correct, my lord?" "Yes, Hawks. I find myself impressed by Will's various talents. I should like others to share my appreciation for his efforts." "I understand entirely, my lord," Mr. Hawks said, giving him a fond smile. "Thank you, Hawks,"
Hannibal said, pleased to have it taken care of. There was a high probability that Will would cosh him with something for his thievery, but he very much hoped not.
"And have you any idea where my spouse is?" "He has gone to Duxbury, my lord,"
Hawks said, the very picture of dignity with the incongruous addition of several dozen fishing lures dangling from one hand.
"But there is a gentleman—" "Duxbury? What the devil for?"
Hannibal asked, straightening his clothing, even his own mention of his mate prompting the need to groom himself against Will's possible censure.
"I believe he has shown some interest in the family cemetery, my lord,"
Hawks said, stopping him cold.
"He did mention his curiosity on that count."
Hannibal's nose wrinkled in a soft snarl, and he said,
"Have my horse saddled, Hawks. That sharp mind of his is going to be the end of me." "And the gentleman, my lord?"
Hawks inquired.
"He says he is a servant sent from Lady Rathmore."
"He can wait, then," Hannibal said, restless with the desire to be on his way.
"I, unfortunately, cannot."
If Will was at the cemetery, it wasn't due to idle curiosity. He was going to confirm something, most likely the rumor that Hannibal had been married once before, and if there was one thing he did not wish to discuss with Will Graham besides the Omega who raised him, it was the woman he had married before marrying Will. Will watched helplessly as Molly trembled before him, her small hands clenched into fists, her blue eyes bright with unshed tears.
"Molly,"
Will said, distressed by her own distress.
"I don't understand. Why would you believe Hannibal killed your sister?"
"Because she inconvenienced him," she said, stiff with anger and hurt. She swiped her forearm across her eyes and glanced back down at the tombstone she'd been standing in front of. "I don't remember her very well. She was already almost grown when I came along, but the whole town knows what he did to her, and just because he's rich and powerful he is able to get away with it." Will shook his head slightly, still confused, and leaned to look around Molly at the stone.
"Melinda Lecter, may you find peace in death,"
was inscribed on its face, with a span of dates that summed only 16 years.
"Melinda Lecter,"
he murmured, his concern sharpening.
"She was your sister?"
Molly nodded and laughed, thick with tears. "Not that you'd know by looking at us, but yes, once upon a time we Fosters were part of the Lecter family." Will took a deep breath, fear settling in his belly like a weight.
"She was Hannibal's first wife?"
Molly nodded emphatically, wiping her face with her hands.
My mother always told me that when he first came to live with his grandfather, he met my sister at the fair and they became playmates, she said, casting another long look back at her sister's tomb. She said they were best friends, and all sudden, when she turned 15, he cut her out of his life. Mother said it devastated her. She took to bed, sick all the time, sent him letter after letter.
Will reached out and took her hand without thinking, squeezing her fingers in his, her painful recollection like a thorn in his imagination, so sharp that his heart ached for her and her lost sister.
I'm sorry, she said, taking a shaky breath. This isn't anything you'd ask to hear.
Please tell me, Will urged, anxiously watching her. It's something I should know, Molly. She looked at him for a long, assessing moment, and finally nodded when Will whispered, Please, Molly, tell me what happened to your sister.
I couldn't have been more than 3 or 4 when she got sick. I don't really remember much, just some things here and there, what others have told me. But one day he showed up and carted her off. I do remember the coach coming. It was the grandest thing I'd ever seen. I thought Melinda was a princess and he was taking her away to a royal castle.
She laughed sadly at that, dabbed her eyes with her shawl, the worst of her tears over.
But he didn't. He eloped with her like she was some kind of embarrassment, Molly said, drawing a deep, steadying breath. Gods, it was such a scandal. We didn't see her for a month, and out of nowhere Mr. Stamets came in and told my parents she died. He gave them some kind of settlement to shut them up about it. The Duke had her in the ground that same day, no wake, no service, just brought the coffin over as soon as the hole was dug and put her in.
Will absorbed that in silence, a strange stillness falling over him to have his sister's gossip confirmed. Hannibal had been married once before. She had died within a month of marrying him. He drew a shuddering breath, pulled in different directions by what he knew and what he wanted to be true. He desperately didn't want this to be true. They didn't tell your parents what she died of? He asked, letting go of her hand to put his arm over her shoulder, comforting both of them the best he knew how. Molly shook her head again, her loose hair bouncing around her cheeks.
No, they didn't. Not that I know of. The Duke was furious when Lord Clarges brought her home, though. Everyone says Hannibal killed her because the Duke was going to disinherit him. He's got a temper, so that makes a lot of sense. Not to mention that he fled the country the moment she died. He didn't even come to the graveside. Even the Duke had the good grace to come to the graveside.
Will patted her again, his thoughts racing. He knew too well how easily it was to rile Hannibal, but he also knew that Hannibal was not so easily forced into doing something he did not wish to do. If he'd married Melinda by choice, then even the threat of being disowned like his father had been wouldn't have swayed him. But something had. 16-year-old girls did not just die suddenly without warning. And Hannibal had finished medical school by then, so he would have known ways to end her life that the local authorities would not think to check for. He wasn't entirely sure what to make of it, but one thing was certain. Melinda Foster had gone into Hertford House alive, and come out again a month later in a coffin, without explanation, accompanied by a large settlement. It certainly put doubts into Will's mind.
I'm sorry. I just really needed to get that off my chest, I guess, Molly said, offering him a shaky smile. I've never really talked to anyone about it before.
Please don't apologize, Will said, giving her shoulder a squeeze. It must have been terribly difficult for you and your family to lose her, especially under such circumstances. She nodded, her smile firming up under the weight of her usual good cheer.
It just gets me that he never paid for it, not like us normal people would. But it's all in the past, and there's nothing I can do for it now. I'm sorry for throwing all of that at you, Mr. Graham.
Please don't be sorry, Will said, earnest and sincere. You've had a very painful loss, Miss Foster.
And you have a very kind face, she said, somewhat flushed with embarrassment once the anger and hurt had drained out of her. Tentatively she smiled at him and asked, Do you think what you're looking for is here? Will gave her a smile of his own and nodded slightly, willing to change the subject at her insistence.
It is, yes. I think I know enough. Thank you, Molly, for all of your help. You want to thank me? Then feed me, Mr. Graham, she said, her raspy laughter making a welcome return. That hamper is your lunch, right? You bring enough for two? Knowing the staff, yes, I did, Will told her, grinning. I am more than happy to share for taking your time. Well, it's not eaten here will make them all jealous, Molly said, gesturing at the gate. That tree makes a nice shade. We won't have to share with your horse. Will laughed softly at that, and the two of them left the sombre silence of the cemetery to retrieve his packed lunch.